Hey everybody, Sam Pedro here, back today with another book review, and I just finished the book Endurance by Alfred Lansing, and I have to say I was absolutely blown away. Have you ever read a book about a subject you didn't really know anything about, but as you read you just couldn't stop thinking about that subject and the story? Because that's exactly what happened with this book. And so this is about Ernest Shackelton and one of his expeditions to Antarctica that went horribly wrong. Today I'm mostly going to be summarizing the voyage which Ernest Shackelton took. It was known as the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Voyage. And yeah, I want to recap it and then also share some of my takeaways from the book. The book was published in 1959, but I never felt like I was reading a 60-year-old book. I thought the writing was phenomenal. This is Ernest Shackelton, and in the year 1914, he took a crew of 28 men to go to Antarctica, and they wanted to be the first people to ever cross the entire continent by land. And this was kind of the last great Antarctic voyage, which hadn't been accomplished yet. So they departed from South Georgia Island, and the goal was they were going to cross through the Weddell Sea and land in Antarctica, cross the continent, and on the other side of Antarctica would be another boat with supplies, and that's where they would end their voyage. The crew set sail in a ship known as the Endurance, and they left during the Antarctic summer through the Weddell Sea. So they didn't make it very far before they found themselves stuck in the ice, and the ice started forming around them, and the weather was really bad for even the Antarctic summer, and pretty soon they were completely stuck in an ice shelf. They spent a few days trying to pick at the ice, and they would try to force their way through the ice, but the ice kept building, and eventually they realized they were just going to have to settle down, that they couldn't make any progress against miles and miles of thick ice. They adjusted to being stuck in the ice. They kind of accepted it, and instead of trying to force their way through the ice, they were going to wait for the next summer for the ice to melt, and hopefully they could then navigate themselves through the ice. Even with the men hunkered down, Shackleton kept the men to a strict routine to help them keep focused and not think too much about their situation. They were pretty much stuck in an ice sheet, floating and drifting through this great ocean. The dogs, which they brought, almost 80 dogs, were taken off the ship, and they made igloos right up by the ship, and that's where they housed the dogs. There were also plenty of seals around, which they hunted, and that's what they ate. They did bring, obviously, a bunch of supplies with them on the boat, and so they were pretty well fed at this point. And this was their life for months and months and months as they just drifted through the Weddell Sea. But their situation wasn't going to last forever. As they went into the Antarctic winter, a couple of bad storms came with winds howling, and the ice started to squeeze around the ship, and they eventually realized that the ice would totally conquer the ship, and so they got as much of the supplies as they could off, and eventually the Endurance did sink. And this is one of the last photos ever taken of the Endurance. This kind of leads into part two, and so now they're off of the boat and they're camping on the ice. And this is when life really starts to kind of get miserable. They described it as being always wet and always cold. The seals also migrated, and so they lost a lot of the fresh meat, and they had to start rationing the little supplies they did have. Fortunately, they did have a really great navigator who was able to tell them exactly where they were on the map. And they realized that they were drifting closer and closer to some islands. And so the goal was to wait till summer, and then they had 3 mini lifeboats which they had taken off the Endurance, and then they were going to sail for these islands. They camped on the ice for months and months and months, and at this point it had been almost a year and a half since they had originally departed. And I think morale was pretty low as rations started getting smaller and smaller. But Shackleton did a great job at leading the men and inspiring them. Eventually they began to see islands out in the distance, and the ice started to melt, and so Shackleton gave the order, and they decided to row towards an island. And the book says that they rowed for over 80 hours straight, non-stop rowing. They were freezing and falling asleep, but they finally made it to Elephant Island and got on land, and it had been 497 days since they had been on land. Almost immediately after arriving on the island, Shackleton, he organized a party of 5 men to go on this boat, which was the James Caird, to make an attempt to get to South Georgia Island, because Elephant Island wasn't inhabited. It was too far south, and they knew that they had to get to South Georgia Island, where There was a settlement and a lot of whalers. The remaining men waited on Elephant Island. This is a picture of one of their huts that they built while they waited for Shackleton to return. The problem was that South Georgia Island was over 800 miles away from Elephant Island, and they also had to cross into what is known as the Roaring Fifties, which is some of the roughest, non-forgiving water on the earth, and just constant storms and winds blowing at all times. They would be doing all of this in a 22-foot open lifeboat, and when all is said and done, this would be known as one of the greatest small vessel journeys of all time. This is a photo of South Georgia Island from space, and as you can see, it's covered in snow and very mountainous. Shackleton eventually made it to South Georgia Island, but of course nothing was going to be easy, and they ended up on the wrong side of the island. And South Georgia Island had never been crossed by land, so they were the first ones to do it, and as you can see, they had to climb mountains and go up and down over these mountains and ridges to eventually get to the settlement on the other side. The book details how they shocked the settlers there. They just couldn't believe that this was actually the crew from the Endurance, because it had been almost 2 years at this point. It took 3.5 months, but Ernest Shackelton was able to finally get a boat to get down to Elephant Island, where he was able to rescue his men. So after nearly 2 years, the crew was finally rescued and out of harm's way. This was just an amazing tale. I was so fascinated by it. I can't stop thinking about it. I want to read more about Ernest Shackelton and some of these Antarctica voyages and expeditions that happened. The book doesn't go into much detail about Shackleton's leadership style, but I did learn a lot about leadership and courage. It's just amazing to me to think that these men spent 2 years floating on ice in the middle of an Antarctic sea and rode to an uninhabited island covered in ice and snow. And for 2 years, Shackleton was able to inspire hope into these men. He never lost hope, and that radiated to all his men. And during this whole 2-year ordeal, not one life was lost, and this really was one of the greatest adventure stories of all time. This book is amazing. I would recommend it to everybody. I was completely enthralled. I want to read more, as I already mentioned, about this subject and maybe even more in this style of kind of like an adventure story. I thought the book was really well written too. I thought Alfred Lansing did a really good job. He interviewed 10 surviving men. Again, he wrote this in the 50s, so 40 years after. And a third of the men with Shackleton kept pretty detailed diaries. So we got a pretty clear picture about what was happening during this voyage. Yeah, hopefully you found this interesting. If you did, I recommend this book. It obviously goes into a lot more detail than I could at this time. But it was so fascinating. I think you would love it and enjoy it. I hope you liked this video. I had a lot of fun reading about and learning about Ernest Shackelton and preparing this video and just thinking more about what I learned and what I read. If you liked it, give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. I'm going to continue to try to make videos like this. I hope you guys all have a great day.